It's been a while since I've done one of these, and I apologize for that, but I'm really excited about Kitty Pryde, so I felt the obligation to make this video. The objective of these pre-release reviews is to talk about potential synergies of the card, try to figure out where the card's going to sit in the meta, and maybe give you a better idea of whether you want to spend the tokens on Kitty Pryde or not. So let's jump into an overview first. Kitty Pryde is a 1-cost card with 0 power. Her text reads, you can return this to your hand to gain +2 power. First of all, Kitty Pryde can only be played once per turn. This was confirmed by one of the developers on Discord. Unfortunately, it's not in my notes, but I will have a screenshot on screen for you right now. And of course, it would be absolutely ridiculous if Kitty Pryde could be played multiple times in a single turn for a couple reasons. One, it would break the fundamental rules of the game currently. When you lay a card face down and then you lock in your turn, that's you playing the card after you've locked in your turn. Additionally, that card would be absolutely broken, mainly because of combinations like Beast and Mr. Negative, which make Kitty Pryde cost 0, letting you play it an infinite number of times each turn. So thankfully the card's locked to being played once per turn because of the rules of Snap, and we don't have to worry about that. I absolutely love the design of this card. Kitty Pryde is a 1-cost card that scales, so to make an easy comparison, we're going to be taking a look at Sunspot. Now, Kitty Pryde does grow quote-unquote twice as fast as Sunspot, but it doesn't actually work out to be that amazing in the end. So for example, if you were to play Sunspot on turn 1 and then pass 1 energy every single turn, that's the exact amount of energy you would have to spend on Kitty Pryde, so we're just going to assume that you're only passing 1 energy. Sunspot would grow to a total of 6 power. On the other hand, if you were to play Kitty Pryde every single turn, she would only grow to 8 power. So she is +2 over the Sunspot, but Sunspot is infinitely more flexible. Because of that reason, Kitty Pryde's probably not going to be this infinitely scaling thing that you might want her to be. Kitty Pryde won't be your win condition, at least most games. She's going to be a support card for the rest of your 11 cards in your deck, rather than something that you rely on. Kitty Pryde's a really good option to counter cards like Green Goblin and Hobgoblin, even cards like Debris Kitty Pryde does pretty good against. Anything that adds cards to your side of the field, Kitty Pryde's going to be a really good response to, because you can always pick her up and play her later, effectively moving her. But really the important part of that is that we're removing a card from a space that would otherwise be full. Moving on to synergies, following that same concept, Lockjaw is fantastic synergy with Kitty Pryde. One reason is that she's a cheap card, so we can just play her into Lockjaw quite easily, but if she pops out of Lockjaw, we can just pick her up and then throw her back into Lockjaw, or we can just make space on the Lockjaw location. I think Kitty Pryde and Lockjaw are going to be best friends. Definitely expect to see a lot of Kitty Pryde and Lockjaw used together. Pretty rare that synergy comes in a 2-in-1 package, but we're going to talk about Mr. Negative and Jane Foster in combination with Kitty Pryde. Now, I know this sounds weird if you haven't played the Jane Foster negative lists before, but there is a certain number of 0 power cards that you need in that deck. Ideally, you would have the entire deck be 0 power cards, with the exception of Mr. Negative and Jane Foster, but there just aren't enough good 0 power cards to run in the deck. It doesn't even particularly matter that Kitty Pryde isn't insanely powerful when inverted by Mr. Negative. It just matters that she happens to be a good card on her own, and also meets that draw condition that's written on Jane Foster. So I will be running Kitty Pryde in my Jane Foster negative list for sure, and I thought it was at least worth mentioning here in the synergy section. Moving on to the Collector, of course, is fantastic synergy with Kitty Pryde. Well, maybe less so now, because Collector's much less of a powerhouse than he used to be, but if your deck happens to run Collector, Kitty Pryde is a card that you might at least consider running. Obviously, whenever you pick up Kitty Pryde, she's going to add +1 to Collector. I actually wonder what that will look like, because in theory, Collector should gain power mid-turn. That's obviously not going to resolve until the turn starts resolving. So you're going to pick up Kitty Pryde, and it's going to look weird because you're going to pick up Kitty Pryde, and then Collector's not even going to gain his power until you've locked in your turn. So it's going to look pretty weird, I think, but whatever, as long as it all resolves correctly. Next up is Taskmaster. Now, I don't think this combo is particularly strong, but it's at least worth mentioning. If you do play Kitty Pryde every single turn, you get her to 8 power. You can play Kitty Pryde and Taskmaster both in the same turn. I thought it was worth mentioning at the very least. Angela might be pretty decent synergy with Kitty Pryde for a few reasons, right? One, we can just pick up Kitty Pryde and continually play her on the Angela location, buffing up Angela alongside buffing up the Kitty Pryde. But in addition to that, decks that run Angela are usually going to have a pretty low curve anyway, so they're going to get punished less for that 1 extra energy that they pay every single turn just to buff up their kitty. Moon Girl and Kitty Pryde also play well together. Obviously, if you have this massive Kitty Pryde in your hand and then you play Moon Girl, you'll have access to 2 big Kitty Prydes. And in addition to that, if Kitty is already on your board and you top deck Moon Girl, you haven't lost that synergy, because you can just pick up Kitty and then play Moon Girl and then play Kitty the next turn, as opposed to playing her on the same turn that you picked her up. And lastly, I want to mention Beast. Now, this interaction is a little slower because we have to take an extra turn to set this up, but the result is that we get a 0-cost Kitty Pryde for the rest of the game. Now, Kitty Pryde doesn't get +2 power when you add her to your hand. She only gets +2 power if you drag her to your hand. So if Beast is the reason that Kitty's entering your hand, you're not going to get any value out of it. You're not going to get the +2. But the fact that we're reducing its cost down to 0, in theory, that's quite nice because it mitigates the +1 energy that we have to spend every single turn for Kitty Pryde. But at the end of the day, that's a 2-card combo that you need in your hand before turn 2, because keep in mind you have to play Kitty Pryde on turn 1, so she needs to be in your opening hand, and then you need to play Beast on turn 2 to have that set up. All right, let's go over some example decks. This is for the people who are going to be picking up Kitty Pryde. As with any of these deck suggestions, keep in mind that this is just a starting point and not a final list. So these aren't meant to be optimized, though some of them actually might be really good. Let's take a look. All right, let's start off by putting her into any deck that has Lockjaw in it, and right now the best deck with Lockjaw in it happens to be Thanos, and I think she's got a pretty good home here. Once again, like I said during the synergy section, if she pops out of Lockjaw, it's not the end of the world. We can just drag her out of that location, then play a new card into the Lockjaw location, and then as a result of that, we get a 1-2, which isn't bad stats, and we can even try to scale that up later if we want to do that, though it's not particularly necessary. While this is probably going to end up being the home for Kitty Pryde, we're not going to be trying to get a 1-8 or a 1-6 or anything crazy like that. We're almost certainly just going to use her as a 1-0 or a 1-2 most of the time, because once again, we're just trying to play her into Lockjaw or move her out of that Lockjaw location. This is what I'm going to be doing with Kitty Pryde. I'm going to be throwing her right into my Jane Foster negative list. I made some adjustments to accommodate Kitty Pryde here, but for the most part, this is the deck list that I currently run today. I won't bother going into detail about this list because if you haven't heard me talk about this list already, you're probably going to hear me talk about it in the future, so I won't bore you to death with it here. Moving on to Bounce Bros. This comes from Wes D4 Best, or Wes the Best. He's a community member who's been playing Bounce Bros since, well, for as long as I can remember, and this is pretty much his exact list. All I've done is taken out Scorpion and I've put in Kitty Pryde because it seems like Kitty Pryde might find a home in Bounce Bros. Bounce Bros is already a pretty underrated deck in my opinion. I pick it up and play it every so often, and every single time I do, I'm like, wow, why aren't more people playing this deck? It seems really good. Wes seems pretty hyped for Kitty Pryde, and I'm not sure if she'll make a final slot in the deck. It's not like she gets any bonuses by being picked up by Falcon, for example, and there's going to be times where you want to play Falcon, but Kitty Pryde's in the way, and you don't want to pick up Kitty Pryde, but perhaps that's going to be okay. I don't know. It requires testing, but it would be silly for me to not mention Bounce Bros. All right, this next list is a bit of a homebrew. I haven't tested anything like this before, but it's all in on Moon Girl and, of course, Kitty Pryde. Now, there's other synergies in here like Moon Girl and Hood, Moon Girl and even something as, it sounds silly and basic, but it is effective, and that's Nova Carnage. This is definitely the most experimental list in this video, but it's definitely one I want to try out. All right, now that we've talked about Kitty for quite a while, what's our conclusion? I think Kitty will occupy a unique space in the game. She'll become the final piece of current deck building puzzles and even future deck building puzzles, but despite that, I don't think the card's going to be particularly strong. The one energy that you have to quote-unquote float to bounce her into your hand is no joke. Think about how often Dream Dimension flips, and it completely ruins your entire game plan. Now imagine having to build around that exact concept. Now obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that because of course you can be a bit more flexible with Kitty. You don't have to pick her up, you can choose to leave her on the board, and in some games you won't even draw her. But I think more often than not, people are going to get lost down the rabbit hole of trying to make this massive Kitty Pryde, and it's going to just lead to their downfall. I've never done this part of the video before. This is a brand new segment for these card review videos, but I want to review their variants. We have 4 new variants coming to the game for Kitty Pryde, and I think that these are really awesome. First, we have this one by Carmen Carnero. I think the character herself here looks really cool. Unfortunately, I don't really like the plain background. Usually I like more intricate and complicated backgrounds because I prefer black and white splits over the gold splits, but if you're a gold enjoyer, I think that this variant would work very well with gold just because the background's already very plain, so you don't feel like you're missing out on having that background that you lose when you get the gold split. This next variant is a more realistic take. People who like art germ variants probably gonna like this one just because it's that same realistic aesthetic. Now obviously it's not an art germ, but in that similar vein of a realistic aesthetic. I love the way they work the dragon into each of these pieces. It's really cute. I think this one's the best one, at least so far. That's the wedding dress Kitty Pryde. I will say there's like a really dark line underneath her jawline that looks kind of strange, but still I think this is my favorite variant of all of the Kitty Pryde variants we have so far. And the last one is a classic Kitty Pryde. This is also a Jim Lee Kitty Pryde, so I know there's a lot of people trying to collect all the Jim Lee variants, so this one should be on your radar. So finally, to spend tokens or to not spend tokens. I do think Kitty Pryde belongs in most Lockjaw decks. I think we're going to see her pop up pretty consistently among any deck that wants to run Lockjaw, but outside of Lockjaw decks, I think her impact's going to be fairly minimal. So if you're careful with your tokens and you're trying to hold out for the best of the best, I'd say do exactly that. Unless you're like a Lockjaw player. If all you do is play Lockjaw, Kitty Pryde might be worth it for you. If you're just looking for a fun card and you've already got like 12,000 tokens or more saved up, I'd say Kitty Pryde's probably worth it, especially if you have a deck lined up already that you want to play. But if you've only got like 6,000 tokens and you're still looking for a fun card, I would hold out. Kitty Pryde's definitely going to be fun, but I think a lot of people have this image in their head where they're going to be playing, 8 power Kitty Prydes and doing some crazy stuff with that, but realistically, I don't think Kitty Pryde's going to be the win con of most decks. Even the decks that she shows up in, she's just going to support other cards. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.